I would like to take the opportunity to give the floor to Leima Martinez, someone who surely most of you know, director of the Asia Pacific Department of the ECAP, to send a message from on behalf of our institution. Leima.
Thank you. I would like to start by saying that it is a great pleasure to be here accompanied through this virtual meeting with all of you. I know that this has been a very difficult year, for the Southern Cross Brigade, because you were not able to come to Cuba as so many occasions before, 37 occasions, and I have to tell you that the Cuban people, not only in Havana but in other provinces, are missing your visit. So we hope that next time you can join us. Meanwhile, this initiative of organizing these virtual meetings on different topics, I think that it will give us the opportunity to give you and many others that we hopefully will be joining in the coming seminars on important issues to understand Cuba, the history of Cuba, but also the future of Cuba, how Cuba is building a better society amid all the complications that we are living with the COVID, with the intensifications of the policies from the United States. That professor today will give us some other details. ECAP, it's continuing working. I'm sorry we cannot remove our mask today. Only professor will be doing that. That's why I won't take much time of my talking, but only thanking you, the Southern Cross Brigade, thanking the Australia-Cuba Friendship Society, thanking the many other organizations that have been supporting Cuba, not only in this time of pandemic, but in the long time history of solidarity. You are most welcome to ECAP, this time by this virtual meeting, and just a short greeting to all of you. I will give back the floor to Ivan, to Adam, and of course the professor that it is accompanying us today.
Thank you, Leima. Likewise, I would like to give the floor to Adam Myers, who a few months ago was elected as a new coordinator of the Southern Cross Brigade, and he will comment on what is planned with this virtual event, and also with the future of the brigade when you travel here. Adam?
Yes, thank you, Ivan. First, I'd like to note that I am presenting, and many are watching here on traditional Aboriginal land, and I'd like to extend my respects to elders, past, present, and emerging, and note the sovereignty was following on from the brilliant work of Leah, who was my predecessor. I'm also the secretary of the Australia-Cuba Friendship Society Canberra branch. The Southern Cross Brigades have been going from Australia, New Zealand and Cuba since 1983, and we are really keen to continue that legacy into the future. Obviously, for the last 2 years we've not been able to travel to Cuba because of the COVID-19 pandemic, but we're hoping that these monthly seminars will allow us to continue the education piece of the Southern Cross Brigade by providing information to people on topics that they would have learned about by professors and other experts in Cuba as part of the brigade. One of the key focuses of the brigade moving forward will be to try and engage university students, people early in their careers, and otherwise attempting to overcome the kinds of difficulties that young people expect to face. Climate change, growing inequality, the destructive nature of capitalism, etc. and so on. And I believe that many of us in the Cuban Friendship Society understand that Cuba has been demonstrating examples of solutions to many of these problems for many decades, and these seminars will help us to understand some of those attempts at solutions. So things like in education, Cuba has a genuine universal education model that has taken a country that pre-revolution had enormous amounts of illiteracy to a 100% literate country. Cuban educational specialists have been working, for example, in Aboriginal communities in Australia to increase literacy here, as well as create pathways for tertiary education, etc., for young Aboriginal people across our remote communities. In medicine, of course, Cuba is a global leader in a variety of medical disciplines. On vaccines, obviously we know that Cuba has 3 vaccines that have been approved to be used in Cuba. Alongside that, we have lung cancer vaccines. Other vaccines have been developed in Cuba to attempt to rid the world of some of the medical conditions that lead to early death, particularly in the third world. We know about the international medical brigades during COVID-19. Thousands of Cuban doctors have travelled all over the world to support many nations in responding to COVID-19. But even at the moment, there are Cuban doctors in Haiti responding to the earthquake there. So the idea is to try and get young people and other people with an interest engaged in Cuban solutions to these problems that we all face, and use it as an educational tool. When Brigade is up and running, we travel there, of course, but in the meantime, through these monthly seminars, to stop people from falling into nihilism about facing many of these great risks and dangers that we face in the coming decades, but to see that there is an alternative, there is a solution, and think about how we can implement some of the models and systems that Cuba has implemented to overcome those issues ourselves. So today's seminar, the first of what will hopefully be a series of monthly seminars, is on Cuba-US relations. We've tailored it to an Australian audience, and the hope is to ensure that everyone watching here today, I think we've got around 50 people at the moment, that you can all have a grounding in why the United States acts like it does against Cuba, and what are the historical footings, I guess, of that relationship. And we have a fantastic expert here from Havana to discuss this with us, and without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Ivan and the Professor to begin that presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Adam. Next, we're pleased to introduce you, the Professor Ernesto Dominguez, who is an investigator of the Center of Hemispheric and United States Studies, who will offer the conference on the subject of Cuba-US relationship. For this, our academic will begin by offering the background of the U.S. interest toward Cuba, and then fully dig into the state of relation from the Cuban Revolutionary period. Without further ado, Professor Dominguez.
Okay, thanks. Are we staying all here? Or?
No,
Okay. Because I'm supposed to remove my mask, so, okay. Well, I will be happier if you move further away. You know, it's about keeping social distancing, all that is nothing personal. Okay, much better. Well, first of all, good morning to you, good evening for us. It's a pleasure for me to be here. This an incredible opportunity to have this opportunity to talk to people from the other side of the world who are actually interested in at least getting to understand a few things and become friends with us, which have been going through a very, very complicated time. Actually, all times for Cuba for a long time have been complicated, but the recent few months, the last couple of years have been especially complicated. So this is very, 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 it's a very, very happy opportunity for me personally and for all of us here, actually. There is a couple of things before I begin with the lecture. First of all, the English I speak is American English with a Cuban accent, so you may find sometimes some difficulty in listening to what I'm trying to say. Sorry for that. Second, I really hope that the rugby championship come together and you can have it at the end. I'm a really big rugby fan, believe it or not. Even being in this part of the world in which rugby is not a big thing, for me it's a big thing. So I kind of feel closer to you already. So, the topic that brought me here, that brought all of us here, is of course the relation between Cuba and the United States. I have a brief presentation to happily be sharing with you. By the way, the presentation is, they are seeing the presentation? Okay. Okay. I'm operating, it's not moving, but yeah, I'm seeing it move. Stop sharing. Sorry about that, just a technical problem. I just want to know if you are receiving the presentation as I operated.
We can see the presentation. All good.
You are seeing what I'm doing. I mean, moving the presentation forward. Right now, are you seeing it?
Yes.
Okay, that's good. Cool. I was not sure, but thanks. Okay, so first of all, I'm gonna be talking. My presentation or my lecture gonna be divided in 4 moments. The first one, I'm going to be covering the history of the relation before the revolution, which is a very long one. The main components of the history of the relation between the two countries since the Cuban Revolution, and I will be paying special attention to the last 2 moments of the presentation to the last 3 administrations of the United States. First, Obama and Trump, and later, last but not least, the Biden administration, what is the few months we have of Biden administration and what that has meant for the relationship itself and for Cuba as a country. There is before the revolution, we have a relationship. We began having a relationship a long time ago, and this is something I think is very important. This relationship between Cuba and the United States is not a simple one. It's not a new one. And we are talking about a multidimensional complex relation in which you have economic relationships, you have political, social, cultural relations that have shaped the multiple aspects of what is to be a connection between Cuba and the United States and what is to be Cuban and what is to be American in this context. We are talking about centuries of history. About 400 years, maybe more, because of course the early connections began back in colonial times. And very important, the essence of the relation, the core of this relation which have led to the conflict we have lived for decades, actually for more than 60, 70 years, actually I will say that for over a century, well over a century, there have been a conflict at some point, at some level. We have to do with the fact that the relation has been articulated around 2 very different national projects. The Cuban national project of building a sovereign nation here in this part of the world, in this archipelago that we are, and the American national project of becoming a power. First a regional power, and afterwards a global power. And very simple, putting it very simple, when you have those two kinds of national projects, it gets very small area. The one that covers both the United States and Cuba and the very narrow straits of Florida. There is no way around. There will be a conflict because those 2 national projects are in course of collision since they are both defined. The early times of the relationship, of this Cuba-US relationship, began with in the colonial times, with people going in discovery voyages to what is the United States, especially Spaniards. I'm mentioning here Hernando de Soto. He was the governor of Cuba back in the 1500s, and he died in what is today the United States trying to discover the Fountain of Youth. This was supposed to be in Florida. That old, the relationship is that old. This is about 450 years ago, not yesterday, way beyond that. And of course, there were very sporadic interaction between the Cuban, or much better put, the Cuban criollos, the Creoles in Cuba, the Spaniards and people from Spanish descent that live in Cuba, colonists, well, Australia as New Zealand are both a result of colonization, so you understand what being a colonial country is. Yours much newer than ours. Ours is much older. And there were contacts between the colonists in Cuba and the colonists in North America, and a large part of what is today the United States were ruled by Spain, and was ruled from Cuba. For example, what is Florida was ruled from Havana for a long time, and the possessions of Spain in that part of what is today the United States were part of the Cuban environment, for example, the 1700s and early 1800s. There were, this is also interesting, at least to my eyes, there were attempts, since both countries were still colonies, by North American colonies to take Cuba from Spain for themselves. And of course, Cuba was one of the theaters of the 7 Years' War between Britain and Spain, well, actually Britain, France, and Spain, during which the Havana was temporarily occupied by the British forces in 1762. And even more interesting to me, and very unknown in the United States, is that Cuban criollos actually supported the American independence. Not only by raising money, which they did, but also by sending forces to fight the British during the American Independence War. They talk a lot about the French support, but a little about the Spanish support, and even less of the Cuban participation in that effort. But what is closer to what is happening today, there have been a permanent interest in the American elites about Cuba, considering that the acquisition of Cuba was not only desirable, but important and even indispensable for the United Nations. And we can trace that back all the way to the founding fathers, Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, you name it, all of them at some point, one point or the other, they expressed the interest and the need for the United States, for the newly born United States at the time, of acquiring Cuba one way or the other, which is an integral part of what they defined in the early 1800s, actually the 1820s, as the Monroe Doctrine, which was actually written down by John Quincy Adams, later President of the United States. But this Monroe Doctrine, which essentially says that this part of the world, the Western Hemisphere, is for the Americans. This is a very well-known document, which is a foundational document for U.S. foreign policy. And we can think that it's 200 years old and nobody cares about that anymore. That is simply not the case. A couple of years ago, not an official, but an influential politician in the United States was talking about how the United States needed to contain and reject the presence of, let's say, Russia or China in Latin America on the base that those countries were violating the Monroe Doctrine, which is something quite interesting because nobody else in the world have to follow this doctrine. That is just a doctrine of foreign policy for the United States and nothing else. It's not a legal document in any other capacity. They were, as part of that policy, they tried to acquire Cuba from Spain. They even offered to buy Cuba. They offered up to $300 million US dollars back in the first half of the 19th century. Just to put it in perspective, a few years before that, they have bought Louisiana and Alaska from France and Russia for about 20 times less, both combined, 20 times less than what they offered for Cuba. That in itself is telling you how important it was to them. Of course, there were economic interests involved. It had to do with the Cuban industry that was expanding quickly in the 1800s, but it had to do with a few other things. If we look at a map, you see that Cuba is very well located at the center of the Caribbean Basin, the Great Caribbean Basin, an area in which, if we look at the next map, there are several major trade routes that happen to cross this area and have been doing so. I mean, these have been the case for the last 500 years since the colonial expansion of the European powers. And since the Panama Canal was built in the early 1900s, this importance of this region and the geographical location of Cuba just increased after that. Because if you see here in this map, we are surrounded or very nearby major or secondary choke points of the World Trade networks. Just this is telling you how relevant Cuba's geographical location may be. That's why, and this is something that has been the case for all this period of time, the long history, the first reason why US have had an interest in Cuba is, of course, a geopolitical factor. It's the idea of the trading route, but it's also the idea of protecting the US itself from the potential threat posed by a foreign power, but also, and probably more so, the ability to build a power structure in this region for which they had to control these major choke points, these major trade areas, and they have to control the main geostrategic points in the region. And Cuba is at the very center of this region. It's at the very center of this network of geopolitically and geostrategically important areas. That's why geopolitics is a first factor, as it is ideology. I'm not talking only about communism versus capitalism, or the way they call it, liberalism or democracy, whatever they call it. It's about also the idea of nation sovereignty, independence, and how that essentially essentially opposes the idea of US domination, which is, ideologically speaking, something that they have believed, at least the elite, and have made a lot of people in the US believe that they have the right and even the duty of controlling this region as a way to make the world a better place. That's a way in which they place it. Remember that they have called themselves the shining city on the hill and the beacon of freedoms and democracy for the whole world. And many of the discussions they have had along their history are about the better way for the US to help the rest of the world become more like them, which is quite interesting if you ask me. They consider themselves that. I'm not talking about the average American, although many of them do, but this has been the political credo in the United States for a long time. Of course, it has to do in a deeper way. It has to do with the interest of American elites of advancing all these plans, and especially in recent years, like in the last half a century, the role of Cuba and Cuba policy in electoral politics in the United States has been a major role. We're going to touch on these other aspects along the lecture, but I think it's very important from the very beginning to have this as a reference to understand the history and the present situation in this relation. During the 19th century also, on the Cuban side, US represented something, represented a symbol of modernity, represented the goal for many people in Cuba of what they wanted Cuba to become, of what they wanted Cuba to be part of, because there was an important annexationist movement in Cuba in the 1800s, and some remnants that remained over time. But at the time, in the 1800s, it was important, mid-1800s. Largely because it was the main destination for Cuban sugar exports, and therefore the main source of wealth for Cuba. And there was a problem of slavery. US was the last major power to abolish slavery, and for the Cuban planters who owned hundreds of thousands of slaves, it was a bit of a problem over time, especially after the Haitian independence, the potential threat posed by this slave, and they wanted foreign power who could help them to control those slaves and their potential revolts, which, of course, by the way, in Cuban history there were many slave revolts. So anywhere there were slaves, there were many revolts. In Cuba, there were many of them, also in the US. And Spain was not the best suited for that particular role. So for many of these slave owners, the Cuban slavist and plantationist elites, US was the best option to the rise. And of course, that also have to do with the fact that they were sending their children to study there, so they were learning about the ways of the US, the ways of doing business with them. And even for lower classes, US was a destination for their immigration when they moved looking for jobs, looking for better economic opportunities. The independence war in Cuba that happened in the second half of the 1800s, sorry if I'm going a little bit quickly on this, but the problem is that there is too many things to talk about. They cover 3 decades of the Cuban history, and it's the moment which the Cuban nation effectively emerged as a reality, as something that was already formed. This is between 1868 and 1898, and we have 3 wars. It's the longest independence process in all of the Americas, and the U.S. played a role all the time. First, by opposing the Cuban independence and supporting Spain, and the fact that they do that, they did that, have to do with the interpretation that they made of the situation in Cuba, in which they thought that the Cubans actually achieved their independence. The power vacuum that will be created in Cuba will be filled by the British, and they were trying to prevent that from happening, so they supported Spain. And later on, when the last of the Cuban independence wars, which by the way was organized by Jose Marti from the United States and organizing Cuban immigrants, Cuban exiles, these were actual exiles, and most of them, some others were economic migrants in the United States, organizing these communities, these immigrant communities in the United States and elsewhere. And he projected the last independence war not only as a war for the Cuban independence, but also as a way to contain the US in its expansion throughout the Americas. And this is relevant in the last, well, not the last thing that Marti wrote, but the next to last letter that he wrote, which is very famous in Cuba, the unfinished letter to Manuel Mercado, in which he wrote something which is to me the most clear expression of how he understood the independence process, when he said that everything that had been doing until that point was to prevent, through the Cuban independence, the expansion of the United States around the Caribbean and their ability to fall with that increased force on the lands of the Americas, of what Marti called our America, Nuestra America, everything south of Rio Grande, everything that every area in the Americas that speak either Spanish or Portuguese. So, since those early times, since the colonial time, during the Cuban independence wars and all of that, this relationship was evolving as a combination of what was happening in Cuba, but also the interest on the American side to control Cuba due to all the factors that we were discussing. And it ended with the American intervention in the independence war preventing the completion of the revolution. Marti had died, and they presented themselves to the world and to their own population in a way which is very different from what we in Cuba understood, what Cubans understood at the time that we understand now. For example, for Cuba, the independence war were the birth of the nation and the basis of the Cuban national pride. You can find it there, and we represent that reality in the art and in the arts and in other areas as a heroic fight against an empire. Whereas the Americans presented in a very different way, in which they were the brave ones that were protecting the Cuban, which will present as a damsel in distress. They were protecting it from the threat of Spanish bandits, which is the way, a very, I would say, distorted way of presenting the reality of a 30 years long war. And as a result of that intervention, they built what we, and there's a lot of discussion in history about this, what we can better present as best explain actually as a protectorate, which is actually a form of colony with all these legal documents that were created, the Platt Amendment, the Treaty of Relations, the Reciprocity Treaty, which effectively gave the United States, granted the United States the legal right to intervene in Cuba, even militarily, if they deem it necessary, to protect their own interests and the stability in Cuba. Something that has been happening in the world afterwards, but in a different framework, actually was legalized in Cuba through these treaties and this amendment, which was imposed to the Cuban Constitution in 1901, and they effectively used that right, the right that they gave themselves through these treaties, 4 times at least, by intervening militarily in Cuba, including a second military occupation for 3 years, and other interventions in 1912, 1917, 1923. So, through these treaties, through the Platt Amendment and the military interventions in Cuba, U.S. effectively had the upper hand in Cuban politics, on the Cuban economy, and essentially they controlled Cuban life, all areas of Cuban life at the time. In the 1960s, that changed a little bit, actually changed in form, especially with the U.S. government renouncing to the use of military intervention as a tool in foreign policy. But instead, they found a way to impose their order on Cuba and elsewhere, by the way. They tried first in Cuba, using the National Armed Forces as a political tool in restoring order, at least in the way in which they understood order, which is the order that fulfill their needs or that serve their needs or their interests the best. And this is the moment in which enters Fulgencio Batista and enters the Cuban army. Fulgencio Batista, who led all the military coups that were ever organized in Cuba, except for one in 1933, all the others, 1934, 1936, 1952, were all led by Batista. And the one that he didn't lead, he was part of the group that actually led the process. And this is what is called the neo-colonial period in Cuba. Why neo-colony? Because there were no longer a legal framework that established that Cuba had to subordinate its foreign policy or its domestic policy, as it was the case before, to the United States. But in fact, through the means of supporting local politicians, controlling the Cuban economy, and of course, exercising all the forms of pressure not exactly established in any law, they effectively control the reality in Cuba. All of this was part of a transition that emerged from a revolution that happened in Cuba in the 1930s, which attempted to break from this dependence, but managed only to change it to a more modern version of that. This is why the Cuban Revolution of 1959 was not a result of one specific moment in history in which there was just one dictator and everybody hate the guy, and so they went all out against him. It was a result of an accumulation of processes and events and lack of sovereignty of Cuba and the social problems that emanated from all this system, which just only the Cuban oligarchy and some part of the middle class, the upper and middle class and some other sectors of society, they benefit from the system, but there were millions of people that did not. A combination of that was what led to the revolution, among other things, because given the history of Cuba, independence and sovereignty are directly connected to social change due to the dependence, due to the association between the Cuban traditional elites and the American empires that founded. So, this is why, since the Cuban Revolution, which brought a very radical, deep social transformation, including in the early times an agrarian reform, that effectively reduced the control of either Cubans or foreign planters on the land in Cuba and distributed among the Cuban peasants, because at the point where most of them did not own the land. This created a situation in which there were few things that happened at the time. The Cuban elites, they realized that they were losing their grip on the Cuban politics and the Cuban economy. They fled, they left the country, along with those who have been part of Batista's dictatorship, the Batistianos, who left in 1959. But of course, it also brought a hostile reaction from the United States. Not only because of what happened in Cuba and the ways in which it was not a democratic transition, because at the time, in fact, in the early moments, it was not a communist revolution, as they would put it, although they painted it as a communist revolution. It became a socialist process afterwards as a result of the radicalization of the process, due, among other things, to U.S. hostility, although not only because of that, but in part because of that, especially the rhythm was set by this hostility. And part of this hostile reaction, or this hostile reaction, began in 1959 itself, and it led to an increase in radicalization, as I was mentioning, of the revolution in Cuba, which in turn generated more hostile reaction from the US in a crescendo of conflict that led to what we know today as the deep conflict between the socialist revolutionary Cuba and the United States. But in the early 60s, it included the very famous events like Bay of Pigs invasion, 1961, all the Cuban Missile Crisis, because this happened in the midst of the Cold War, and there was also a major role played by the Soviet Union. A country with which Cuba generated complex association was not free of conflicts and misunderstandings, and there were back and forth in the relationship. And above all, because Cuba has been painted at the eyes of many people by the US and others as a puppet state of the Soviet Union, as a proxy of the Soviet Union in the region. In fact, especially in foreign policy, Cuba acted quite often in spite of the Soviet Union's preferences and what the Soviet Union wanted to do in different moments. The best example is, of course, the Cuban intervention in Angola, the Cuban participation in Angola in 1975, which the Soviets didn't want to happen, and Cuba essentially forced the hand of the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union had to support both Cuba and Angola in that process. And all of this was met on the American side with more hostility, terrorist actions, from killing Cuban diplomats, trying to kill Fidel Castro and all the leaders of the revolution. Fidel Castro still has the world record in assassination attempts. It's about 636, I think, is the last figure I heard, which is impressive. This is more than 10 a year, or actually way more than 10 a year, between 1959 and 2016. So that's quite something. And of course, other terrorist actions like the bombing of the Cuban airplane in Barbados in 1976, which is the biggest terrorist action in the Western Hemisphere after, actually, the second only to the Twin Towers in history. So it is significant. Well, actually, there was a bomb in the US in 1994. It was a little bit bigger. But next, after those, is the Cuban airplane in 1976, which is considerable, and it was organized by people that were supported by the CIA and US government in this capacity. So there was decades of growing conflict with Cuba looking or having the support of the Soviet Union in this complicated way. There was an attempt of improving, generating a reapproachment between the two countries in the late 70s, but it failed in a couple of years after a few events, including things like the twist in the American government after 1979 and the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan and the Islamic Revolution in Iran, and of course in Cuba, the 1980 military crisis of Mariel, which all of that combined, those events came together to change the situation and generate, essentially stop the process and generating more hostility on the American side. And during those years, they built what we still have, which is what we call in Cuba the blockade, and they call it the US embargo. By the way, this is not just a semantic distinction. Embargo is a legal procedure through which, in this case, internationally speaking, a country can't ban its nationals from trading with a second party. That is perfectly legal. But the problem is that these American measures are not meant only to prevent this trade between Cuba and the United States, are also oriented to punish any other third party trading with Cuba. And that means that they are trying to stop any form of trade between Cuba and the world. The idea they have presented many times that Cuba can trade and can have any non-relationship with any other country in the world except for the United States is simply false. That is absolutely false from day one. They have just increased this character, but they have been there since the beginning. And here we can see that the basis of that blockade were set actually very early on. Here, the first regulation is from 1960, but actually the first actions began in 1959 itself. That's why when the Soviet Union collapsed and the Eastern European Socialist Bloc that represent the 85% of Cuban foreign markets collapsed between 1989 and 1991, and Cuba was in the midst of a huge crisis. Until now, it's the worst crisis we have had in peacetime. It's even worse than the one that we have now. I'm talking about numbers. Of course, COVID aside, economically speaking, that was the worst one ever. In that context, the US had a choice to make. They could either try to engage with Cuba in a more normal relationship and in that way try to gain some kind of influence, or they could go for more pressure and more hostility, and of course they choose the second option. That is where we get when we get the blockade laws, Torricelli Act to 1992, Hemispheric Act to 1996, that were complemented with other actions either inside Cuba or outside Cuba, executive measures, executive orders that prevented, for example, banning Cuba from using US dollars in international transactions, which is huge and hugely harming for the Cuban economy because Cuba cannot operate directly with dollars, and that is very, very important because that essentially excludes Cuba from 70–80% of international markets just by definition, and also excluded from most sources of credit worldwide. And you know that the economy operates on the base of credit, not on the base of out-of-the-pocket expenses. And in that process, they added a new, or not new, but new for Cuba, a tool that is blacklist. The idea of creating lists of entities and individuals are sanctioned specifically with which nobody in the US or elsewhere could deal unless they are willing to face punishment in the United States. And that means freezing their assets, banning them from entering the United States, etc., etc., etc. So they took something that was already bad and they made it even worse and added several additional layers of complexity. So what they created, what they developed in this process was a very, very complex network of policies and legislation that is intended to harm Cuba, which amounts to economic warfare. So that was the situation when Barack Obama came to office. He came with a different speech, and he advanced in a policy in which he said that he wanted to change things because the blockade policy was too old, was outdated, and was a failure, which it obviously is. If the goal of that policy was to overthrow the Cuban government and retake control over Cuba, it was an obvious failure, unless their goal was to harm the Cuban people. Otherwise, it was a failure, and it is still a failure. So he intended to change it, not because, and this is important, not because he was a nice guy, he probably is, I'm not saying he's not. I'm saying that even in the speech, when he announced to the world on December the 17th, 2014, after a few years in office and in his second term, when he was already in the last couple of years of his tenure in the White House, he announced to the world that US was restoring diplomatic relations with Cuba and was changing the policy. He had made some decisions before, not decisions that announced this 2014 change, but improving a little bit the relationship between the two countries, getting rid of some of the latest additional measures imposed by George W. Bush, Well, remember infamous George W. Bush, which today seems like a great president, by the way, when compared to others. But in that moment, when he came to office, he changed some of Bush policies, but the core of the blockade remained essentially the same, except for some specific areas. But in 2014, he announced this change in policy, which, by the way, at the time I was participating in an event that takes place essentially every year. It's an academic event on Cuba-Us relations that every year gathers specialists and academics from the US and Cuba. And we're all there for 3 days discussing, well, President Obama could do this or that, but he won't because it's not possible because of the political situation, etc., etc., etc. And the last date of the event was December the 17th. So essentially the event was over when we watched on live. We watched the interventions by Raúl Castro in Cuba and by Barack Obama in the US. And then we realized that we had to go back to the drawing board because we were wrong about what was happening and what could happen. What really changed at the time were a few things. The first of them was, of course, the restoration of diplomatic relations. There were general licenses for some enterprises and entrepreneurs to do business with Cuba in certain specific areas. Many of them selected very carefully. For example, telecommunications. That was one of the core areas in which they gave these licenses for American companies to operate with Cuba, and a few others, but that was the main one. Some hotel companies got these licenses. Of course, the airlines, they received licenses to operate in Cuba for the first time with commercial flights, and so on. They took Cuba out of that unilateral list of countries that sponsor terrorism, which Cuba was a member since 1982, was taken out by during Obama's administration, and that administration also eliminated a few policies, like for example the wet food, dry food policy that allowed Cubans who arrived to American soil to remain there as political refugees, and a very harmful program that was the Cuban Medical Professional Parole Program, which was targeting Cuban medical professionals, the one that Alan was mentioning earlier, serving around the world. It was targeting those professionals and was trying to attract them to go to the US for two reasons. First, it was a way to drain brains from Cuba. These are among the most important professionals in the country and in the world, medical professionals that are coveted all around the world. And also, and of course, they have a political impact, and especially because, of course, this kind of cooperation have a very significant influence on the countries in which Cuba has sent its doctors, and also, and of course, they have to do with the Cuban prestige around the world, but also it is a source of income for Cuba, this kind of agreements. So when we combine all of this, this program in particular was targeting these medical professionals have been put in place by George W. Bush, and Obama stopped this program. Why did Obama do this? There are many possible reasons, but I think that we have to consider at least a few of them as the main ones. First of all, U.S. was adjusting its foreign policy to a new reality. 2014 is not 1995. It's a very different world. It was a very different world at the moment, with countries that were emerging as world powers, China first and foremost, but also Russia coming back as a world power. And then you have other countries that have the ability to advance their own interests in spite of US preferences and interests, and often in opposition to the United States. I'm thinking about Iran, for example, one of these countries. And other countries that are in better terms with the US, but also have their own interests, and they have their ability to exercise influence in their region, and they have a potential to become more so. For example, India have a huge potential, not completely developed, far from it at this point. And you can see other countries that have this potential at a different scale, as in Vietnam, for example, which is an influential country in in Indochina, and you can mention others. In that context, Latin America was also in a situation of change, a moment of change. There have been the left-leaning governments in Venezuela and Bolivia and Ecuador and a few other countries, and Cuba was there as an irritant in the relationship between the US and Latin America. And there were even decisions made by this government, many of these governments, that they would not be only participating in, for example, the Summit of the Americas, one of the main events in so-called inter-American relations, which is United States and Latin America. That's what we call Latin American relations, inter-American relations. They decided not to attend to the next summit if Cuba was not invited. So it was becoming a problem for the US, for US foreign policy in the region, this conflict with Cuba. Also, it's very interesting. For the first time, we could identify lobbyists and power groups within the United States that wanted to change that policy, because they identified interests that were best served by changing the policy, not by keeping this failed policy and hoping for the future in which Cuba will collapse. Also, there were changes going in Cuba. I mean, in the opening to new forms of management and ownership on the sector of the economy that open opportunity for investment. So for many of these potential sectors in the US that potentially may have interest in Cuba, this was possibly an opportunity. And last but not least, what Obama discovered and demonstrated is that it could be good electoral politics to do that. He managed to win Florida twice, in spite of having a much softer, in the Americans, in the way in which they understand that, much softer speech and much softer policy towards Cuba. And he also managed to split the Cuban-American vote, split almost half and half, which is significant because there have been this picture according to which the Cuban-American vote in Florida is decisive. It is actually very influential, not necessarily decisive it could be, but it's supposed to be a block of voters that go all the way, all for whoever treats Cuba the worst and supports Republicans 100%. He demonstrated that that was not exactly the case, even though there is a significant support for Republicans. There is a majority support for this kind of, for Republicans and for this kind of policy. There is significant support, I mean, for hostile policies. He demonstrated that it was possible to go the other way and still have success in elections in Florida, which is a very important state in the United States. I cannot emphasize this enough. Large part of this have to do with the importance that Florida has in US elections, in which presidents are elected indirectly by people, by the Electoral College, which allocates its spots to whoever wins the state, no matter by how much, doesn't matter by how much. So they have only 538 electoral votes, and Florida, until last election, had 29 of those. It is a very, very important state. And it has been decisive a few times and very important in all other recent elections. This is a fundamental component. This is why electoral politics and domestic politics in the United States is a major part of the explanation why the American policy towards Cuba is what it is. As you know, after Obama, we have a very different president. A very different president who won the election just due to the Electoral College system. He actually lost the popular vote, which is only the fourth time that happens, but it's the second, and was the second in 16 years, because it had happened in 2000 with George W. Bush. And one of the most staunch supporters of Trump was this right-wing Cuban-American elite in Florida. He actually met them during the campaign. He went to the 2506 Brigade, the site of these people, which is organization named after the force that invaded Cuba in Bay of Pigs in 1961. So we know what we're talking about here. And he also was very influenced by the hardliners in the United States, not only Cuban Americans, but hardline neocons that became part of his government, and hardline Cuban Americans like Mauricio Claver Caron, for example, which was later appointed for the National Security Council, and later he was appointed for the Inter-American Development Bank as special kind of a prize for his support. And as part of that, Trump, he went all the way to destroy Obama's legacy in general, but in Cuba policy also, including not closing the embassy in Havana, but reducing to the minimum personnel and closing the consulate, which essentially rendered that embassy inoperant in essentially every meaningful way, other than keeping in touch with their allies within Cuba, because of course part of this is also keeping and increasing support for opposition within Cuba, which is one of the main issues here. This part of this policy is supporting groups within Cuba that oppose the government, which as a result of this are not legit in the sense of being real opposition that wants to protect the Cuban sovereignty, but just want to change the government or even the social system. These are people that serve U.S. interests, most of them. So this creates a situation in which opposition within Cuba is just a tool, at least most of it, is just a tool as part of the toolkit that the U.S. have in this policy. And he also introduced a number of additional sanctions, reversing actually all of what Obama had done. Maybe not denouncing there were 22 agreements already signed by the moment. Those were not denounced, were not destroyed, but they were rendered ineffective because of the additional sanctions and the changing policy, and of course creating an environment that was harmful for anything that resembles a normal relationship between the two countries. That included the end of the suspension of the Title III of the Helms-Burton Act. This is significant in one fundamental way. Title III of the Helms-Burton Act is the part of the law that allows American persons, whether they were American citizens or not at the moment in which their property in Cuba was nationalized, allow those people that own property in Cuba was nationalized in the 1960s to sue in front of American courts any third country-based company that operates with what they identify as stolen property. That means European, Asian, Australian, if they invest in Cuba, companies and persons that may do business that include property that is somehow included in those that were nationalized, which, by the way, that's a right that every state has, and they would have been done many times around the world. But of course, the case of Cuba was not something they could forgive, because of course it was done against the interests of the United States. And the last but not least, he used the process of blacklisting more than anybody else before, and added over 550 Cuban entities, meaning enterprises and other economic units for the most part, in those blacklists, effectively harming or limiting to the minimum, the bare minimum, if any possibility at all, for engaging in any meaningful economic exchange with any foreign partner. This is significant because the bulk of those were included in the blacklist in 2020, in the midst of the pandemic crisis. So when we're talking about these sanctions, we're not talking about something that happened in the past or something that has remained the same for decades, but something that have been changing over time, and that have, if we compare the current crisis linked to the pandemic to that of the 1990s, the two worst moments in Cuban history for the last 60 years have the moment in which US government has decided to introduce more, deeper, more comprehensive sanctions reinforcing the blockade against Cuba. That's, I think, very telling about the nature of US policy and, of course, the nature of the relationship, which we can go all the way trying to explain that, but essentially the same factors, but interpreted from a different position in the US, because there are different groups in that country that supported Trump and supported his administration. And I just want to add something here. For the first time in US political debate, socialism emerged as a word, as a concept that was used by a political candidate instead of political forces, not to attack that concept, but to identify themselves. I'm talking about Bernie Sanders, I'm talking about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the progressive forces in the US. They have called themselves socialist. So in this context, socialism was or emerged as something different from communism, but the political speech by Trump and his people, they went all the way, changed their speech, and when in the past they used communism, when in the past communism was used as a way to identify everything that is bad, that is wrong, that is anti-democratic, that is authoritarian, etc., 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 they substitute, they use socialism instead, not because they realized suddenly that Cuba is socialist and not communist, despite the fact that it's a communist party, whatever, because they wanted to link socialism in the way in which they presented to the public in Cuba or in Venezuela, which is very different in many ways from Cuba, but there is the idea of building a form of socialism, to their own political opponents within the United States. So this is why I'm insisting, domestic politics, along with geopolitics, is a fundamental factor in understanding US policy and therefore the relation between the two countries. This chart that I'm presenting here, this is a compilation of all the sanctions that have been introduced, or were introduced between 2001 and 2020, just as a way for you to see how many new measures were introduced at different moments. This is something that changed every single year, every month, and sometimes every week. For the last year of Trump's administration, actually a year and a half, we had new notices and new measures every week. That is why this is so relevant. And this is what Biden found when he came to office. Biden, Grandpa Joe, who there have been a lot of debate if he was the right person for the job, he found that countering crisis, not only the pandemic, but the economic crisis, which is not only caused by the pandemic, it's a structural crisis, but he also found an international system in turmoil, not only because of strong administration, but because of the changes that have been occurring for years, and due to policies that were not able to cope with the threats and the challenges emerging from that international system. And of course he had to deal with the health crisis and the political divide in the US, political polarization. And we also can find here something different, because Latin America, who have been moving apparently to the right for the last couple of years, it went back to have left-leaning governments getting into office in several countries, some of which, for example, Bolivia had a military coup military/civil coup in 2019, and yet they managed to go back to a democratically elected left-leaning government of the same party that had been overthrown in 2019. It retook the government in 2020. And also we had left-leaning governments in Argentina and Mexico and a few other countries. Even Peru this year had elected a leftist for president, who, by the way, is connected to Cuba because of the party he is part of and all of that. So there was a change in reality in the country. And in that context, Biden he chose not to act for a few months, for the first 6 months of his administration. He said that Cuba was not a priority. He was revisiting the policy, but they were deciding what to do, but it was not a priority, so they would not be making any decisions, which effectively meant that the sanctions and the restrictions introduced by Trump and everybody else before him remained in place. Nothing changed in those months until July 11 July this year. You know, the demonstrations in Havana, the protests in Havana, which were largely triggered by a campaign organized abroad from the US and Spain and a few other places. There is a mountain of evidence that this is the case. I'm not saying that the people who protested were all paid for that, or not even the majority of them. They were legitimate grievances in the people. There's an economic crisis, there is a pandemic, so there is a lot of people that do wanted to express that discontent, but those protests were triggered by these campaigns that we have seen in social media happening for month and month, that actually began last year. This particular generation of campaigns, because this has been the case for years and decades regarding Cuba, and then in that context, Biden reacted by adding new sanctions. So he's not only that he didn't do anything to lift some of the sanctions introduced in the midst of the pandemic by Trump, but he added new sanctions, not necessarily sanctions that add to the restrictions for the Cuban economy, but political sanctions that do have an impact on the let's say environment around Cuba, that signal to the world that the US is not willing to engage with Cuba in trying to look for a more normal relationship, which, by the way, normal between Cuba and the United States is not clear what it is, because there is no definition that fits both narratives about what normal is, but at least a more normal one. And they have been talking about doing some things regarding the remittances and all that, meeting with people there, but in fact, nothing major have changed, and the mid-term, long-term impact of prior sanctions is becoming more and more evident, with more companies quitting their business with Cuba having to end some activities because there is no, for example, the Cuban central bank have to stop accepting deposits in US dollars in cash, because it could not use it in international transactions due to the existing sanctions and so on. So all in all the last three administrations, they had managed to, despite the variability, to generate a situation that is today much worse than what it was in 2013 or even in 2008, for example. So we are even worse than what we were back before Obama's administration. What may happen in the future? At this point, I can see only three scenarios. The continuation of Trump-like policies, that's what is happening right now. And stagnation here, no more, no any new sanctions, but leaving things what it is, which essentially amounts to keeping policies what it is. Or, hopefully, maybe going partially back to some of Obama-like policies, but it may be a combination of some of these policies. For example, there have been some ideas of returning to lifting limits on remittances that were introduced by Trump or reintroduced by Trump, or a few others, or reopening or increasing the personnel in the Cuban embassy in Havana. But all that may happen, maybe. But at the same time, you're going to have other sanctions that will remain in place, and these new sanctions will remain in place, the new political sanctions. So, in fact, when we think about it, when we analyze all of this, I think, first of all, the goal is the same, and this administration, probably like Trump before, is thinking that there is a moment of weakness in Cuba and they want to exploit it, or at the very least, wait and see if the Cuban government collapses in this context, And they are using this justification to have the possibility of justifying themselves and to have what is called plausible deniability. They are not acting because they wanted to destroy it or to harm the Cuban people, they just reacting to events or whatever. That's pretty much it, and leaving you with a list of some papers and books we have in my center. We have produced in the last few years about on these topics, which may be of interest of you. Most of them are in Spanish, but some of them are in English. I hope that some of them may interest you at some point, that you may read it, and also hope that this, not as long as I figured initially, presentation was of interest. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Ernesto Dominguez, not only for the quality of his intervention, but also because of the extension of the period that he refers to. Now is in order and space for question. I noticed that Alan has gathered some questions that you have been expressing on the medias, on the social medias. So Alan. We can hear you.
Sorry, there we go. All right, I've got a number of questions coming through. I will feed them through now. Firstly, Professor, you commented on the impact of the Florida voting bloc, the Gusanos in Florida, and you noted that the influence of those voters is decreasing. Do you think that is a permanent thing? Do you think the influence of the Florida voting bloc will continue to decrease and be less impactful on US foreign policy?
Well, let me take this off to talk to you, because otherwise we'll deal with harder. Well, there is a few things. First of all, Florida as a state will increase its importance in American elections because they just had the census and they will reallocate the seats in the House of Representatives, and that means the reallocation of the electors, the electors in the electoral colleges. So, given the increase in Florida's population, the relevance of the state will increase, and it should remain what they call a swing state that could be win by any candidate, because the idea is that about 75 to 80%, sometimes more, of the states, everybody knows who will win them before the elections begin. But there is a few states that are the one that decide. Florida is the biggest one of those. So in that sense, Florida will remain and will increase its relevance, will remain relevant and will increase its relevance. Regarding the Cuban-American vote in itself, it should decrease its importance because the Cuban-American population is growing, but much more slowly than other communities. For example, Puerto Ricans are growing much faster, and other Latino communities. These communities don't have the same behavior as the Cubans have, although they are much less politically engaged, so they don't participate as much as Cuban Americans do, which have some of the highest levels of participation of voter turnout in the country as a whole. But all in all, the relevance of this, the Cuban-American vote should decrease over time in the next few years due to demographic processes and so on. And there is also the fact that in spite of whatever the Trump administration and the Cuban-American politicians have been saying, the Cuban-American vote remains divided, not 50-50, but at least 30 to 70 and maybe 40 to 60. Which is very significant, which that means that in conditions of decreasing percentage of Cuban American voters, if it is not a bloc, if a voting bloc, they will lose influence in that sense. That being said, the Cuban American political influence is not only due to how many voters they have, And this is also important to understand. There is a political machinery. This is an expression by Alejandro Portes, who is a Cuban-American sociologist. He studied, among other things, the Cuban-American political machinery in Miami, in Florida, specifically in Miami, that is very, very influential in terms of organizing political activities, gathering, raising money, supporting campaigns, and at the same time they receive funds from U.S. budget as part of the $20–30 million every year appropriated for supporting democracy programs in Cuba, which at the end most of it remains in Miami and is in turn used to pay for political campaigns and all of that. So we have a situation in which the Cuban-American vote will diminish its influence as a voting bloc, but the Cuban-American political machinery will remain influential for much longer time. So we have not seen the last moment of that influence, and we are not likely to see it in the next few years.
Thank you. We have a question that I think is quite relevant to some recent events that took place in the UN. The question was around what international mechanisms are in place, what international fora are in place to attempt to push back on the illegal US blockade in an attempt to have it revoked.
International mechanism? Well, it's hard to find a mechanism that is binding, that could be used in this sense, because of course there is every year there is this resolution by the General Assembly of the United Nations, which essentially amounts to a political declaration and amounts to moral victory for Cuba when almost the entire world supports the end, essentially demands the end of the blockade. But at the same time, it's not a binding decision. The only, in the UN system, the only organ that have the ability to make binding decisions that everybody should follow is the Security Council of the United Nations. And in the Security Council, it's not a very democratic organ in which you have the permanent members, have the veto power, and one of them happens to be the United States. And not for nothing, Cuba has never presented this proposal to the Security Council, because it won't make any sense to present it there. The only way it may have an impact is in the General Assembly, where it could have this kind of political, moral impact. Anything else that we can use, either in the United Nations, in the system of the United Nations, or elsewhere, it's more about political projection, it's more about the moral component of it, it's more about letting the world know what is happening in Cuba, and of course at the same time letting the US government and US people, though most people in the United States probably don't follow these kind of events and don't know about it. Most people in the United States, I can assure you that they have no idea that the United Nations General Assembly have for 29 years now, I think, or 30 years actually, 1992 to this year, has condemned US blockade against Cuba. Most persons in the US have no idea, because some of them don't care, and some others simply have no access to that information in their particular bubble. In social media where they exist, or in the source of information, they don't discuss that, and international topics are not often presented by US mainstream media to the public, unless there is some catastrophic event, Afghanistan type, for example, have been on the news the last few days, but it's a catastrophic event, and so on. So in this context, what can be done is political pressure in every area that is possible, but there is, at least that I can see, I don't know, they are more aware of that, but I don't see any binding, the possibility of having a binding decision in an international organization or organ that can force kind of force the United States to act in this sense.
Adam, if you allow me, I would like to say some comments about the question, but from a different viewpoint. Because we have seen during all these years, can you hear me? Because I'm not going to tell you, okay. Because during all these years we have seen how the solidarity movement have been using other platforms, others than the well-known international forums and the governmental meetings and gatherings. And I think that that is very important to raise the voice against the U.S. blockade. We have been seeing beautiful initiatives, but important voices like the 400 signatures of intellectuals that ask to let Cuba live. But this only as an expression of people united in one international effort. But from the Asia Pacific, we have been able to receive also important donations to Cuba. And sometimes we do not think that this is also a way to go over the blockade, to show to the world that Cuba is needing this just because the policies that are implemented against the Cuban people are preventing us to get access to those products. But also the visits that the Southern Cross Brigade do to Cuba is also a way to show to Australia, New Zealand, and to other countries from the Asia Pacific that it is important to visit Cuba so as to know by yourselves what it is really happening in Cuba. And when you go back and when you organize this type of online events, it's also a way to raise the voice against the blockade. And as Professor said, and as we have been sharing in other moments, the more people know about these policies, because there are a lot of people that do not know, and that's why we consider that this first seminar should go over the history so as to continue to more subjects. Well, the more people know about the blockade, the more we are contributing to lift these policies. And you are also an example because you and many other countries around the world, but I would like to mention in this case Australia, go to the U.S. consulates every month to do protest and to raise the voice against the blockade. And that is also an international effort. And also when you organize collections or medical materials to be sent to Cuba, that is also a way to send to Cuba the message of that we are not alone. And these are expressions that we have been seeing how they are increased in the different regions, and I wanted to mention it because we have had other experiences like the solidarity towards the Cuban Five, and besides the governmental efforts, there were a solidarity movement that pushed and pushed so as to have them here in Cuba. So again, I join the words of the professor to push and push.
One comment before going to another question. It's important because the idea is that the more the people in the U.S. and Australia and elsewhere know, the more they can ask the government to act in a way that breaks with this traditional U.S. policy towards Cuba, and therefore it could help to improve the situation for Cuba, which at the end also affects all the people in the world, because you have some of the countries have people, companies, and organizations that may be interested or maybe benefit from having a normal relationship with Cuba that just cannot. So it's something that not only affects Cuba and Cuban sovereignty, but in fact, it limits the sovereignty of essentially every other country in the world. That's why it is relevant, not only because of us, not only for us, but for the entire world.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much for that very in-depth response. Very much appreciated. We've had a question as well about how Australians can support both the Energy Blockade campaign, and obviously the Australia-Cuba Friendship Society has been running a number of different campaigns over the past few months. So if you're interested in that, please contact your local Australia-Cuba Friendship Society branch. There's also a vaccination resource drive going on in Australia. We've raised tens of thousands of dollars so far. If you're interested in helping out with the second round of donations, feel free to contact southerncrossbrigade@gmail.com or on the screen, and we will provide you with details on how you can support. I'm also happy to put you in touch with any ACFS representatives from your city as well. The next question we have a fair few questions here. I'll try and be quick. But the next question we have is about the increasing influence of China and the decreasing China and Russia, as you pointed out, the decreasing influence of the United States. So obviously the blockade works in large part because the US dollar is the reserve currency of the world. As the power of the US dollar perhaps decreases, as the power of yuan or other currencies becomes stronger, do you see that having an impact if the embargo is not lifted? Do you think the power of the embargo will decrease over time?
The power of the dollar is actually in this particular moment in which we are. The dollar, the US dollar, is the main component of US power worldwide. It's bigger than their military in terms of the ability to exercise influence, because it has been demonstrated that their military can destroy countries, but it doesn't have the ability to build long-lasting structural control on those countries, which at least in the last few years, and right now we're witnessing what is happening in Afghanistan, which is a good example of that. The US dollar, on the other hand, had remained and still remains the main component of that influence due to the international financial architecture that was built since 1944 with the Bretton Woods Agreement, in spite of the abandonment of the convertibility of the dollar in gold in 1971 and the volatility that it introduced in the currency markets and in general in the world markets. That being said, even when until today the US dollar represents over 50% of world reserve, and also it is the currency in which most of international markets are denominated, is the currency used in most international markets. There is an increasing movement, and a very interesting one, especially coming from China, but also from Russia, trying to build a different financial and monetary system that is independent from the dollar. They're even building their own networks for money transfers and other operations that are, until this point, for example, the SWIFT system is controlled by the United States. It's not only about the dollar itself, it's about all the system built upon the dollar. One of them is, of course, SWIFT, which is the most used system for transactions right now. And they're trying to build this difference. This process keeps going, and there is a lot of symptoms that this will keep going, that most probably will generate additional possibilities for Cuba, and not only for Cuba, Venezuela, and all the countries, Iran, for example, the countries that are in the wrong side of the United States and the United States' interest, to have better opportunities to be able to engage in more normal interactions with other countries in the world. For example, to to have commerce and transactions that are not reported to OFAC, which is something that happens every time there is a significant transaction in dollars is reported to OFAC, and then OFAC, the Office of Foreign Assets Control in the Department of Treasury in the United States, they then can decide, they have the ability to decide if they impose any kind of sanctions to those involved in that transaction that is not according to what they have they have in their rules, the regulation, whatever. So this may and will probably create better conditions. That doesn't mean that will happen in the next couple of years. That will take time because of the world economy has a huge inertia, and there is a huge participation of American companies that they probably will not be comfortable operating outside the dollar world, although China may force them to do so. Not force them, but the transition of China to a different currency system probably will make many of those actors to look for the possibility to engage in this alternative system. But then there is another problem, which is Cuba is located, geographically speaking and economically speaking, is located in the immediate surrounding of the United States, in a part of the world in which most of the transactions will keep the dollar most probably as their main currency, or probably their only currency for international transactions in the region. So there is a possibility, there's a potential, but for Cuba we also have to consider that whether we like it or not, we are just 90 miles away from the United States, and it doesn't matter what we do. I would love to take the island out of this location and move it, I don't know, anywhere else that is not this near the United States, but it is simply not possible. If something, the island is moving northward. The geological changes, the country is making the island moving northward, so we're getting a little bit closer every year. That's not good. So it will take even longer for Cuba to be able to engage, to enter this, alternative currency world, but there is a possibility, most definitely. And of course, this has to do with the change in the balance of powers in the international system, which may add some additional layers of complexity as a process, especially because the U.S. in this context will most probably look for reinforcement of its position in this region, again, where Cuba is located.
All right, fantastic, thank you. Ivan, do you have time for 2 more questions?
No, you haven't. Okay.
Okay, so we have time.
Is that okay?
Yeah. Sure.
Okay. The first one is about, you mentioned the Bay of Pigs, you mentioned July 11th, and a few other examples of CIA and American intervention into Cuban sovereignty. If the blockade is lifted, how will Cuba respond to greater opportunities for the CIA through investments and what have you to interfere in Cuban relations? So obviously the blockade would improve the economic conditions of Cuba enormously with its ability to trade around the world, but it may allow the Americans and petty bourgeois in Cuba to have a greater influence than they do now. Do you have any point of view on that?
Sure. That is actually a really good question, and a question that we have asked ourselves quite a few times. I mean, individually, many people have asked this question, although from different perspectives and getting to very different conclusions, but from the academic world, we have also asked ourselves this question. There is something that is clear. The blockade must be lifted, and it's a necessity because just lifting the blockade will improve the conditions in Cuba right away. But not right away, it will take time. But will open the opportunity for a significant improvement of the economic conditions in Cuba, and therefore of the livelihood of the people, and so on. But it will pose a significant challenge. Because of course, as you mentioned, it will open the opportunity for American companies to invest in Cuba, of course, which means additional ways of building influence on Cuba, additional ways of having a presence in Cuba, a presence that in this case will be most probably welcome. So it could be used by CIA, the government in general, not only the CIA is just a major but a part of a much bigger system of organizations, governmental and non-governmental, that have very clear goals regarding Cuba. So it poses a significant challenge in that sense, and also the fact that if we go all the way to engage in relationship with the United States, economic relationships, specifically economic relationships, with American companies all across the spectrum of the Cuban economy, we have the very clear possibility of reproducing a form and a level of dependence toward the United States as similar to that we had prior to the revolution. It is definitely a possibility if all decisions are made solely on the base of narrow economic calculations. I cannot insist enough on this. Any decision that should be made for the future of Cuba cannot be made solely on the base of economic calculations, because that will, let's say, neglect a very important set of conditions that we have to consider: political conditions, social conditions of different kind. The only way for even the economic development of Cuba to be sustainable is to protect the Cuban sovereignty. So there should be a very careful political decision making in which we could manage this process. Just let's assume that will happen. We could manage this process so to have a balanced set of international partners, so we can remain in control of the country, of the the core decisions that are made in this context. That is key to that potential future.
Thank you very much. I think we'll have a final question. We do have a couple other questions. I might send them through afterwards, but I'm cognizant of time. The final question is you referenced how the revolution is, I guess, misinterpreted by some people as say, a purely communist revolution that occurred with the influence of the Soviet bloc and all those different ideas. But in fact, it was bound to a long history of Cuban attempts at sovereignty, at attempts to become independent and to assert itself on the world stage. Are you able to quickly add a little bit more information about the impact of some of the heroes of that late 19th century struggle, like José Martí and Maceo and others, on the revolution, and then also the impact of the masters of the the Spanish-American War, the Cuban Revolution, etc., on Cuban policy today?
On Cuban policy today? Okay.
Yeah.
Cuban policy today, sure. Well, there is at least in my what I can, as far as I can tell, there is a very important component of Cuban policy, domestic. Several components of Cuban policy, domestic and international policies, that are inspired and deeply influenced by this history back there. Most important, the Cuban Revolution, as you mentioned, was a result of a long history, of a long process of nation building, not nation building by foreign power, by the nation building itself over the years. That's essentially what the process that leads to a revolution represents, the building of a sovereign nation here. So the idea of protecting Cuban sovereignty at all cost comes directly from that history. The idea that Cuba as a sovereign country opposes the domination by any global power or regional power, either the United States or any other power whatsoever. In different contexts, there are different powers. We could have good relations with anybody, but we reject to be controlled by anybody else's and don't support any form of domination. That comes directly from that history. part of the ideas of José Martí, for example, or Antonio Maceo, or the revolutionaries in Cuba in the 1930s and 40s, and of course the revolution of the 1950s, and of course the 1959, is based on that fundamental idea. Also, the idea of social equality. Fighting inequality is one of the biggest concerns of all Cuban revolutions since the 1800s all the way to the 1959 revolution, have been fighting inequality. Through social change, through different means, depending on the ways in which it was the reality of the Cuban society at the time, and the interpretation of those who were leading the process, but that is a major component of that. The idea of José Martí that the dignity of the human person is the first law, should be the first law of the Republic. You can interpret that directly as the rights that every person has to have a decent life, and therefore to be on essentially equal footing with everybody else in the country and everybody else in the world. In the early times of the independence process and the first Cuban revolutions, the abolition of slavery, and therefore breaking the first and major form of inequality and discrimination that existed in Cuba at the time, was part of that early revolution, and it also marked the future of the country. We have long-running effects of the existence of slavery in Cuba that we're dealing with that until today, but it's part of the core ideology of the process. And, of course, also Cuban foreign policy, the idea of solidarity, of helping peoples, more than governments, but mostly peoples around the world, is part of that history. As we had friends who came from all over the world to fight for Cuban independence, for example, or those who supported the Cuban Revolution. Cuba at the same time helped all the peoples and other processes around the world. So I will say that those traditions are part of Cuban policy today, until today, and probably will remain there for a long time, both at the domestic level and the international level.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that we'll wrap questions there. On behalf of everyone from the ACFS and the 50 plus people who have joined in to view this live today, an enormous thank you to you and ICAP. It's been a very, very informative seminar. Ivan, do you want to provide some closing words?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Adam. We appreciate your participation in this event. We hope you have found it interesting. We will be waiting for you at the upcoming meeting that will be also be divulged by the page on Facebook of the Southern Cross Brigade, and also by our page, our platform in Facebook, Solidaridad con Asia y Oceanía. And surely through the groups of the Australian and New Zealand friendship societies. Once again, thank you very much to all of you for your solidarity work. We will see each other again soon to continue approaching topics of interest about Cuba. Likewise, Adam and I will be pending of any of your suggestion or request to make this event an increasingly better space for interaction and divulgation of information. I also thank you very much to our guest here, Ernesto Dominguez, for being here and sharing this space with us.
I'm open to any further content in the future if they want.
Okay.
To contact me directly or through you.
Yeah, and probably when the Brigadistas come here, we'll be sharing also with him. Again, yeah. So until the next time, don't miss it. We'll be waiting for you, and of course have a good journey, and thank you for following us and your support.
Thank you, Adam, and thank you all the friends.
Nice work. Good work, well done. Thank you. Awesome. All right. Thank you very much. That was good. I think the response has been really positive. Yeah, that was very, very good. I think we'll iron out some little issues, but that went really well, I think.
Cool. This video will be on the pages of all the
yes.
Friendship Society. Okay.
Yeah.
So thank you very much, and okay, have a good journey and goodbye.
Thank you very much. I'll talk to you soon. Cheers. Thanks so much.
Thanks to you.
¿Y por qué no la música? ¿Me iba a poner una canción?
Sí, él pone